As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, signed by 17 senators.
Unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call. So,
James Boyes, Professor of US Politics at Richmond University, just watching this with me. Explain then what is going on right now. We just heard from Mitch McConnell there.
Sure. So what we're seeing is a cloture motion, which is basically a vote to end discussion and then eventually move to a full floor vote on the issue, which isn't expected today, it must be pointed out. So what we'll see here is a roll call in alphabetical order of the members of the United States Senate, moving from A through to Z, basically asking them to vote yay or nay on this. And some of the names to take a note of are people like Susan Collins, for example.
Let's listen in.
Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Aye. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. No. Mr. Kyle. Aye. Mr. Lankford. Aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. No. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Kennedy, Kyle, Lankford, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Manchin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Heinrich, Kane, Klobuchar, Leahy, Markey, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Peters, Schatz, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Jones, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Donnelly, no. Ms. Heitkamp, no. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no.
So that voting underway, quite tense there on the Senate floor. James Boyes, US Professor of US Politics at Richmond University. What's your reading of the voting we've had so far?
Well, it's incredible. There's not too many times I imagine that a live cloture vote has been broadcast on the BBC with such interest in the result. We've clearly seen some interesting voting patterns. We've seen, for example, Joe Manchin, the Democrat out of West Virginia, voting aye to confirm, but we've also seen the senator out of Alaska, the Republican, voting against. So we've got a trade-off there. It's also interesting that Senators Flake and Collins, who had both toyed with opposing this nomination, have voted to end cloture and move to a full vote, which would indicate that they're inclined to vote for him in the final analysis. So this is certainly very, very tense, and there's certainly a stampede of no votes coming in. One would imagine, looking at where we are, those are Democrats adding to the tallies. But certainly this is looking very, very close. And I would imagine that Mitch McConnell is worried that this is closer than he might have imagined.
But just to be clear, this is a procedural vote on whether to go through with the final motion on whether Brett Kavanaugh, or Donald Trump's nominee, should be nominated to the Supreme Court.
That's very true. But of course, if you have Republicans voting against cloture at this point and against the nomination, then that certainly is quite a situation for both the White House and for the Republican leadership on the Senate floor, who, as I indicated earlier, would have been hopeful, quite frankly, of getting this through at this stage, and certainly want to get this done as quick as possible. There was hopes to get a final floor vote as early as tomorrow night, notwithstanding the fact that at least one Republican senator is due to attend his child's wedding. There was some debate about whether the floor vote may even be moved forward to this evening, Washington time. This has got a lot of contention around it. There are barricades up at the moment around Capitol Hill to try and keep opponents' protests as far away from the building as possible, in a relatively unprecedented move, it must be said. So this really is, for those of us...
Senator is not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Carper, no.
And of course, the Senate is very delicately balanced anyway, isn't it, in terms of Democrats and Republicans?
It is indeed. 51 majority for the Republicans, 49 individuals either registered Democrats or voting with the Democrats. So the Republican leadership
Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to change their vote?
can ill afford to lose anybody.
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. On this vote, the yeas are 51, the noes are 49. The motion is agreed to.
So there we are, 51 yes, 49 no, pretty much almost as tight as it could be.
Indeed.